This session is called Can We Just Print Money? My name is Rob Killick. When I told my 16-year-old daughter that I was chairing this session, she said, "Didn't the Germans answer that question in the 1920s?"
I knew you were going to
So
talk
maybe the question should be, why do we sometimes print more money? Anyway, I have Francis Coppola on my left, who's going to introduce us at the discussion for 5 minutes. And James will also have 5 minutes. And now I'll go straight out to the audience. I want lots of questions. Don't think you're stupid because you don't know what quantitative easing is, right? Because it's not that straightforward. And if there are any questions like that, please ask them. We are obviously right now in the middle of in the eye of a financial storm, so that could not be more topical. Francis.
Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here and get a chance to talk about this controversial subject. First, I think we should start with what we mean by printing money, because it's interesting that Rob immediately talked about Germany in the 1920s, when the central bank then printed literally wheelbarrows of banknotes, because that's not what central banks nowadays do. They don't print money. What they do, and we are going to talk about quantitative easing, because that's usually what people mean by printing money is quantitative easing. So let's define it. What quantitative easing is better known, or more correctly known, as large-scale asset purchases. And what that means is that central banks buy lots of financial assets from the private sector, mostly government debt, which they pay for with newly created electronic money of a particular kind known as bank reserves. The money goes to the banks in the first instance. If the assets are purchased from non-banks, every electronic purchase in the country goes through a bank. So those payments, like all other payments, go through banks, and therefore, when the payment is made, the bank, the commercial bank, puts money into the seller's deposit account. So you could say the QE money is created by commercial banks. Indeed, commercial banks create money all the time. So QE replaces the kind of money creation that banks do when they lend. It's a way of getting money into the private sector without having to ramp up bank lending. Okay, that's what QE is. And we've done a lot of it. Over the last 14 years, it really has been a huge amount. From the end of 2008, 2009, until 2019, we had some central bank in the world doing QE all the time. The ECB started doing QE just when the Fed stopped. Did it create growth? No. Did it create inflation? No. That type of QE is not inflationary. What it does do is blow up asset bubbles. We have seen massive rises in asset prices. We have not seen a great deal of growth, and we've not seen a great deal of inflation. And the reason for that is at the same time as central banks were busy creating this particular kind of money and intermediating it through commercial banks who created the kind of money that we all use to buy our shopping, except that it mostly went to people who didn't need any more money. Governments were busy draining money from the private sector. So central banks were putting money into the private sector, kind of at the top end of the income distribution, and governments were pulling it out again, mostly at the bottom end of the income distribution. So we didn't get inflation, we didn't get growth, and what we got was widening inequality. That was until 2019. Then COVID happened, and then the game changed. And then we suddenly got central banks doing the most extraordinary amounts of QE. We got governments giving people loads and loads and loads of money. Suddenly they were all pulling in the same direction. And we survived COVID. We can argue, if you like, about the measures that governments took. Their lockdowns are controversial and all the rest of it. But taking that as read, if you're going to shut down half of your economy, the least you can do is put some money into the economy so that people can survive. And that's what governments did. And we survived. The problem with that is that the US actually rather overdid it because it thought it could try and stimulate demand while it was shutting down half the economy. This wasn't very bright. And so we have ended up with inflation as a result. The supply side was more badly damaged by the COVID shutdowns and everything than I think people were expecting. And on top of that, we now have a war which has seriously raised the price of energy. We have now binding resource constraints. We have, 1 minute. We also have a tight labour market, partly because quite a lot of people have left the labour market in the last 2 years as a result of COVID, and also partly as a result of strains in the NHS. It means you have to wait a very long time for treatment now, and when people have to wait a long time for treatment because they're ill, they get iller and they don't work. All of that together means that right now, doing QE or putting money into the economy in some way, like we had during COVID, would be a very bad idea because it will simply fuel inflation. So what I would say is, yes, we can. We don't print money in the old sense, but we can and we do create money. But what we need to think about is whether we need to be doing it all the time, when we need to be doing it, and when actually is the right time to take money out of the economy. And that's kind of what central banks do. And so that's my thesis, is right now we should not be printing money, but we absolutely can when it's the right time to do it.
I just want to say that just 3 days ago, ladies and gentlemen, the Daily Telegraph had the following report in it. It said that the minutes of the FPC's latest meeting repeatedly note the Bank of England is not responsible for regulating LDIs. Quotes, pension schemes and LDI managers are regulated by the TPR, the pensions regulator, and the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority. LDI funds themselves are typically based outside the UK, said the FPC. Did you get all of that? Because, before we talk about the multiplication of the money supply or it growing, we also have to contend with the alphabet soup that exists in terms of all the regulators of money and lending and spending and borrowing and taxing and all the other things. You will know the FCA, the BOE, the MMC, the Monetary Policy Committee, the OBR, the IFS, and all the other people who are all regulating each other. There's also the Prudential Regulation Authority, a branch of the Bank of England. So that already makes me very nervous about theories that suggest that by having a more clever attitude to money and its issuance and so on, we can actually rectify the problems that surround us. If we look at the growth of cryptocurrencies, ladies and gentlemen, and the way in which central banks are now making their own goulash with cryptocurrencies, just as we have the alphabet soup of regulators, if we look at the terrible feats that quantitative easing has given us in terms of the national debt, in terms of borrowing, in terms of the support for zombie companies of the past 20 years, I need to be convinced how the money supply and controlling it in the manner that is suggested by the advocates of MMT, how that's really going to get us out of the hole. Because where I come from, when we're thinking about supply side economics, ladies and gentlemen, we need to be thinking about the way in which wealth is produced in factories, in services, and through innovation. By supply side economics, I'm thinking of research and development and so on. When you actually look at corporate capitalism today, you'll find that it is not R&D that exercises the finance departments and so on. It is, in fact, financialization of those firms, and in particular, the very large cash hoards that all of the big tech companies have in America show a preeminent like for money rather than innovation and production. And I put it to you that all the discussion around MMT today is a reflection of these large cash hoards and the fact that capitalism is unable sophisticatedly to go forward and produce a consistent round of innovations. It just doesn't do that. Apple's cash hoard at the moment is $200 billion. The same with Microsoft. The same with Alphabet, the owner of Google. So in all of these things, what we see is that the actual wealth-producing apparatus has atrophied, and instead what is thought is that the ruling elite just needs a bit of persuasion to see the error of its ways, to distribute what Milton Friedman, along with Keynes, the intellectual progenitor of this whole theory, helicopter money, as Milton Friedman suggested it. If we just shower people with money, as if the ruling elite would agree to that, then everything will be right, just like it would be with universal basic income. And I think it's very naive because it doesn't address labour, capital, classes in the way that they should be thought about, and in particular the production and innovation process. Instead, it leaves the whole discussion in the realm of money, and that for me is just the sort of reflex of what's going on in the real world. We can have any number of kinds of money, any number of kinds of regulators, and we can imagine that more countries than just America can issue their own money and never be worried about it. The whole focus, ladies and gentlemen, is not on the exploitation of labour, it is rather on spending. Spending and realising that we are not like a household in a national economy, we're more sophisticated than that. Well, that was Thatcher's argument, no need to charge at that straw man. But what we do need to recognise is it's neither a household economy nor a money economy, but a decaying productive economy. And that's the problem that we should seek to address.
Thank you. Big clap for both of the speakers. Yes, gentlemen here.
Yeah, I've been studying economics for the last 14 years independently. And the conclusion I've drawn is that if you really want to understand economics, you need to see the economy as the transfer and exchange of net worth, and by that I mean the things that you own plus the debts that you're owed minus the debts you owe to other people. So apart from producing and consuming tangible things, everything that happens in economics is zero sum. So if I promise to give somebody, I don't know, a car tomorrow, then my net worth goes down by one car, their net worth goes up by one car, and same with anything to do with debt, anything to do with transferring existing tangible assets. It's only production and consumption which affect that. So that means that quantitative easing is the creation of a new debt in exchange for the transfer of an existing debt. So it's zero sum. So the point about this is that you're not creating any wealth when you do quantitative easing, and so that the person with the money's new wealth is the bank's anti-wealth, and this is the thing going in the other direction is just that the bank is owed a debt by the Bank of England, and the insurance company or whatever is no longer owed that debt. Big problem in economics is insolvency. And it seems to me that the Bank of England, when it's doing quantitative easing, is acting like Enron, with the government acting like a special purpose vehicle.
I agree with the first speaker that QE has fueled asset prices, and in particular residential and so on. It's a real problem. And QE around the world, I'm a New Zealander, has been given to the banks and has actually not been passed on to businesses for productive growth as well as individuals. I think one of the big issues we have, particularly in the Western world, is growing inequality. And I see, people tinkering in their garages or volunteering or doing charity work, but are not paid for it. There's an easy way to address that. And the easy way to address that is through universal basic income. So instead of giving QE to the banks, you give QE to the people. And the people then spend it as they wish. So it addresses inequality as well as hopefully productivity and inspiring people to do amazing stuff.
I think Francis touched on this already in terms of inequality, but please could you explain just who are the winners and losers of printing more money, and how do they win and how do they lose? Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to know, how would a society look like if we didn't have a central bank? Would a society function better if it was allowed for money to generate more naturally?
To Francis, modern monetary theory, quantitative easing. Could you define these and why you support the latter but not the former?
Okay, so the person who was saying that the economy is essentially a zero-sum thing, I mean, I'm not sure I agree with that. If you look at, as I think Professor Woodhausen was saying, in terms of production as well, rather just money, because that's not necessarily the case. Because one thing I do agree with Liz Truss on, I mean, I did make a joke that she is like the conservative version of modern monetary theory, in the sense that she's the deficit funded tax cuts is the idea that the economy will take care of itself. But she's right about growing the pie. It's just that she's wrong on the way in which she wants to do it. And I think at the last session with Frank Furedi, he raised a question. Everybody thinks is the economy stupid? And somebody raised, well, why were the lockdowns implemented then? Because that's economically illiterate. But I think there seems to be an assumption that the economy will take care of itself among a lot of people, which I think is why people make stupid decisions like that.
I'd just like to say that I really like the idea of universal basic income. If someone wants to pay me so that I don't have to go out to work, don't have to pay my rent, don't have to pay my food, and I can stay home, watch TV, play games, I'm very on board with that. Thank you very much.
Well, I write down I like UBI because I wouldn't have to work. Right, okay. Yeah, there was quite a lot in there, and some of it I shall leave for James. Probably all the stuff about productiveness, really. I mean, it sounds like your thing. If I may pick up a few things, though. First, a correction. QE is not debt. QE actually buys government debt. If anything, it calls in debt, and the Bank of England is not in debt, and it is not insolvent. Yes, bank reserves are a liability of the Bank of England, but the government debt held on its books entirely balances the bank reserves created, and the Bank of England is therefore not insolvent unless the government is. Now, this is an interesting question about whether the government's insolvent in the light of what's happened in the last week. But assuming that that the prices of government debt hold up, then the Bank of England doing QE does not make it insolvent. We do have a discussion going on about what happens if gilt prices fall, particularly when the Bank of England starts selling the gilts back into the private sector, which it's going to do starting from the 31st of October. But it actually has an agreement with the government that the government will indemnify it. So again, it's not insolvent. It all rebounds back to its owner in much the same way as the finances of any wholly owned subsidiary do. It is the owner, which is His Majesty's government, that is on the hook if the Bank of England loses money because of QE. So it is simply incorrect to say that the Bank of England is insolvent, or is at any risk of becoming insolvent. I might add that there's quite a debate in the economics profession about whether insolvency is even relevant for a central bank with a credible government backstopping it anyway. So if I might put that to bed, I don't want people to start getting worried about Bank of England insolvency. It's just not the case. There was a specific question to me. MMT versus QE, why do I support the latter but not the former? Actually, I don't support either of them, as people who have read my book would know. I am no fan of QE as we currently do it. My argument is that QE it was based upon a mistaken premise, firstly about how banks work, and secondly about how money moves around the economy generally. It was based upon the idea that if you stimulated asset markets, if you gave money to investors, if you gave money to banks, they would somehow spend it all out into the economy and get production moving and get people spending and all the rest of it. And it doesn't work like that, and we know it doesn't work like that. And to my mind, we need a serious rethink about what central banks do and how they do it. So I am actually not a great fan of QE.
I'm well aware that Francis, and indeed Stephanie Kelton, the advisor to Bernie Sanders, favour a kind of leftish version of QE, if I can be so brutally succinct, which is akin to the UBI fans here. And I think the the colleague who said he'd like to watch TV for the rest of his life, gave them, the UBI fans, their comeuppance. It's just too easy, isn't it? With everything going wrong around the world economy, if only these people would see sense and helicopter money to, workers and our bearded friend there with the television set, then things would come right. Well, first of all, the bourgeoisie is not going to do it. And second of all, what about the corrupting influence, as you were hinting, sir, of UBI and this helicopter money? It's a recipe for doing what a hell of a lot of us are doing anyway. 22% of the working age population in this country who are not available to work because they've given up on it. It's in the States, it's known as the Great Resignation. It's different phenomenon. So we've got to be very careful before we want to do all of these things. The second side of the leftish tinge is, of course, that we won't just helicopter money to households and consumers, but we're going to, spend it on a Green New Deal. You don't have to go to any of the green sessions at this conference to know how misguided that job-creating, high-tech, wonderful, innovation-based process that we're always being told about for the last 12 years or so. Where is it? Has anybody in this room actually seen a green job on the high street or in a factory anytime soon, beyond putting a bit of, as I've said before, glass wool in my loft? That's about it, right? So, in this lovely utopian world that is conjured up, even with a left-wing tinge, doesn't do it for me.
Thank you.
Is it too simple to say that QE really solved nothing and that it was just introduced by policymakers in 2008 because they wanted to postpone the day when they would have to tackle all the problems that our economies faced? And 14 years later, is it just simply that we've had so much QE now that those problems do have to be confronted?
Oh, I think that's a very, very, very useful question, and I agree with the premises of it, which means that when you look at the question as to can we just print more money, there is no finite limit to them being able to carry on with what they have been doing. And I think the illusion you had there was that I think the interesting thing about QE was the way that, at least outside Japan, it was introduced as an emergency measure back in 2008 and 9. It wasn't introduced as the mechanism by which the economy would manage to maintain itself over the course of the whole decade. But it just shows that the people supposedly in control are just as much out of control as anyone else, that they do something in response to a problem and then see, well, nothing's broken, so we'll continue it and continue it. And hence we have this situation. Now, I think the problem, which I agree, I can understand, Francis, what you're saying technically, that the Bank of England is not the one creating the debt. Yeah. But there's a very close relationship between the very easy monetary policies of both low interest rates and of quantitative easing in terms of underpinning the commercial banks creating an awful lot of debt over the course of that decade post the financial crash. No. The increase in indebtedness in the economy, the ability of businesses, governments and people to be able to borrow more has been facilitated and enabled by those easy policies. You're shaking your head?
I am shaking my head, yes, because you're actually factually wrong.
I'm sure Rob will give you a chance to come back into that. Yep. But I think that is what's created the dilemma today. Other people, not just me, call it a debt trap, that you have so much debt created in society upon which we all rely just to keep our heads above water, that is what's created this dilemma for the central bankers today, in that, and why for so long they were not reversing the very low interest rates on the quantitative easing, because by beginning to do that, it actually then undermines and throws out to the surface the instability of that financial mountain that has been created. That's why they've had such difficulties, and that's why the dilemma, which we're going to see working itself out over the next few months, is definitely one to watch. Not that they are the be-all and end-all in central banks, but it is a very prime area of this financial instability, which they have created, and which is going to have repercussions not just in the financial markets, but in the real markets too.
For my interest, can I just see a show of hands on how many people think universal basic income is a good idea? It's not got that much traction even amongst this relatively literate economic, perhaps that's why it hasn't got much traction. Right, gentleman here.
Just a question about really the current crisis, and it feels like, although we have high inflation, it doesn't feel like it's consumption-led, it doesn't feel like households are out on the hog spending money like there's no tomorrow. It feels like there's just a crunch, and we've got central banks raising interest rates hard, quantitative tightening happening, an enormous amount of money being sucked out of the economy from people that don't actually have it. And I just wondered, are the banks going to be back to doing QE next spring as the energy price level change passes out of the inflation measure and everyone starts to try and afford their mortgage by just ripping all discretionary spending out of the economy?
I think when we talk about the perils of currency creation, I think it's also important to remember what it means to lose your power to create money, which is, I come from Italy, so a country that's part of the Eurozone, which means that the country has lost the power to issue money, and that has entailed a whole series of very negative consequences, because it means the government effectively loses the ability to engage in any form of economic policy, fiscal policy, industrial policy, investment policy. That, the premise of all that is controlling the currency. Once you lose the power to control the currency, then you effectively lose the power to intervene in the economy in any meaningful way. And that, means that all the major investment decisions in the economy will be made by private actors, which is what happens in these countries. So when we talk about the perils of currency creation, we should never forget what it means to lose the power to create currency, which is, as Wynne Godley, the great British economist, said in the early 90s, when even the UK was debating whether to enter Europe or not, when you lose the power to issue your money, the country effectively becomes a colony, because it means that you depend on whoever issues the currency for you, which in Italy's case means that our country depends on whatever the ECB decides that we can do. So I think that's an important element to bring it into the discussion.
Going just do a little defence of the Green New Deal. I mean, the derision that, there's no jobs except filling people's lofts with stuff. I kind of think that turbines, and I heard a Tory MP boasting about his constituency producing turbines on the Isle of Wight, building them, sticking them up. I'm guessing there are some quite skilled jobs there, and it's very worth investing wherever the money comes from, whether it's government borrowing. It seems to me like a pretty good idea.
Thank you. I'm intrigued by the fact that the people on the right have always complained about the left creating money when they want to, and now, of course, what's happening is the people on the left are complaining about the people on the right creating money when they want to. So that's an interesting intrigue to me. So, but my second point, very briefly, is that maybe we need to just step back and say, the creation of money, there's some people who think you can't. I mean, like people who want us to hold to the gold standard. And there's other people like Keynesian, I'm sure half a dozen people here will know the quote better than me, who said, if you can, then you must. If you can use the money well, then you must. Somebody will correct me on that.
Thank you.
Okay, right. Well, we had a little argument there because some of what was said then is factually incorrect. So maybe just a brief explanation of what banks do, because this is absolutely related to this. Banks create nearly all of the money in our economy. We've gone on and on and on about QE here, and ignored the elephant in the room, which is the amount of money the banks create. Since the financial crisis, banks have actually created rather less money than they used to before it. And that gap has been partially plugged by QE, right? It is kind of almost like shooting the messenger to blame QE for the fact that banks haven't been lending, or for a long time didn't lend as much as they did before, and therefore our economy didn't grow because our economy had come to depend upon ever increasing bank lending. And yes, it's fair to say we need a rethink of that. But let's actually blame the right people. Banks, very low interest rates are actually very bad for banks. They don't like lending at low interest rates because they make money on the spread between the rate at which they can borrow and the rate at which they can lend. And if your interest rates are nearly zero, it's very difficult for them to make any money at all. So the idea that low interest rates encourage banks to lend is absolute rubbish. I'm sorry. I just wanted to put all of that back to bed, if I may, because I do think there's an important point there about rethinking an economy that completely depends upon bank creation of money and bank debt. And we don't have time to get into that now. But maybe that's a session we should hold at another time, Rob, because actually this is really important. So if I might just pick up just one or two other things quickly. I know we haven't got much time, because I wanted to pick up Tom's point about loss of monetary sovereignty. We are privileged in the UK to issue our own currency and to control it. That doesn't mean we don't sometimes do stupid things, like deciding that now when we have a really tight labour market and binding resource constraints is a really, really good time to do a massive demand stimulus. That's a fairly stupid thing to do, but we still have the ability to do that. We'll pay the price for it in the markets, in rising gilt yields and collapsing currency, but we can do it. Whereas if you give up your ability to issue your own currency, you can't do it. And as Thomas said, that actually has creates problems of its own. And those of you who remember the Eurozone crisis might remember how very difficult it is for some countries in the southern part of Europe because they can't control their own monetary policy. So I want to be very cautious about people who think we shouldn't have the ability to create money. We absolutely should. At times we need it. It is a matter of judgment about when we need to put money into the economy and when we need to withdraw money from the economy. I don't think now is the right time to be putting money into the economy.
On the talking about productiveness, Francis, on the turbines question, anybody know how many people are employed around turbines in this country? Yeah, about 30,000. And where does the Wind Turbine Association think that number will go to by 2030 in its optimistic mood? They say 96, I think you'll find, right? So we're looking at tens of thousands here. How many jobs in solar power? 6,000 there. You know, it's not going to set the world alight. It's not going to set Britain alight. And this shows to me that, you know, it's very foolish. Somebody was here rather foolishly suggesting that energy inflation will subside next year. If we've got that many renewables, which are reputedly so cheap, then it'd be fine. But we don't have so many renewables. They're not that cheap. And energy inflation, you heard it here first, you know, will be here and the subject of rising interest rates all through the next year. And I'm not alone in saying that, because the head of Next, the retailers in this country, says the same. So let's not be too sanguine about what's happening here. The important thing to realise is that all of this discussion on money and spending is all very well, but as even enthusiasts for MMT and QE have to recognise from time to time, the referent for all the money that you're issuing and spending has to be output. It's the output of society, the wealth generated in the productive apparatus, that it determines finally whether the currency is debased or whether it approximates to reality. And that's something that, you know, people just don't want to seem to take on from the MMT, UBI camp. The second thing I just want to end on is that, as I've already hinted, the inspiration for all of this is John Maynard Keynes. By pumping money into households, you can create the effective demand, and guess what? It's going to be inflation-proof. I think the past 20 years and the reckoning with inflation that we're now going to have in the next year shows conclusively that you just cannot wish it away, inflation. It's not going to be like that, and we're in for a lot tougher time than our money optimists would have us believe.
Thank you very much. Give them a big hand.